Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking you on a deep dive into inflation.
Ooh, inflation.
You've shared some great research with us, an article from Investopedia called U.S. Inflation Rate by Year, 1929 to 2024.
Okay.
It's hot off the press, published just last month. So we've got some really up-to-date figures to work with.
It's going to be interesting to see those numbers in the context of historical trends.
Right. Our goal today is to go beyond just defining inflation. We really want to understand how those percentages have played out over almost a century.
Yeah.
What's caused those big swings and what it all means for us today.
I think a good place to start is with understanding why inflation matters so much.
Okay, so the Investopedia article gives us a pretty straightforward definition.
Right.
Inflation is the percentage change in prices year over year. But I'll admit sometimes those percentages feel a bit abstract.
Yeah,
Help us connect those numbers to real life.
absolutely.
Like, what does that actually mean for people?
Think of it like this: inflation is really a measure of your purchasing power. If the price of everything goes up by, say, 5%, but your income stays the same,
Right.
you're effectively able to buy 5% less with your money.
Wow.
It's like your dollars are slowly shrinking.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And the article mentions two key ways to measure this shrinking, the CPI and the PCE.
Yes.
Can you break those down for us?
Of course.
No.
The CPI, or Consumer Price Index, is probably the one you hear most often.
Right.
It tracks the average price change for a basket of goods and services that urban consumers typically buy.
Okay.
Things like housing, food, transportation.
Okay, so CPI is like keeping an eye on the price tag of a whole shopping cart
Exactly.
full of everyday stuff.
Yes.
And what about the PCE?
The PCE, or Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, is a little broader.
Okay.
It includes not only direct purchases, but also things like healthcare paid for by insurance.
Got it.
So it captures a wider range of spending.
Different measures, but both telling us the same story.
Yeah.
How much more expensive things are getting over time.
Exactly.
And speaking of expensive, the article highlights that September 2024 inflation clocked in at 2.4%.
Yeah.
Has anyone else noticed their grocery bills creeping up lately?
It's subtle, but those little increases add up over time.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is to compare that 2.4% to recent years.
Okay.
In 2023, the average inflation rate was 4.1%.
Wow.
And in 2022, it was a whopping 8%.
So we're actually seeing some easing of inflationary pressure compared to the recent past.
That's right.
Which is good news. Right?
Yes, definitely.
But the article also touches on the flip side of inflation, deflation.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's not a scenario we want to be in.
No, deflation, when prices are consistently dropping, can actually be really harmful to the economy.
Really?
While it might seem attractive at first.
Like, oh, great things are cheaper.
Exactly.
It can buy more.
But falling prices can lead to a vicious cycle. People delay purchases hoping for even lower prices.
Oh.
Businesses cut back on investment and the whole economy slows down.
So it's like a deflationary spiral pulling everyone down.
Exactly. Now, I know you're eager to dive into the historical data, and I think seeing those trends over time will really bring these concepts to life.
Yes. Let's take a look at how inflation has ebbed and flowed throughout U.S. history, starting with the year 1929.
1929.
Why 1929?
Because that was the year the stock market crashed, ushering in the Great Depression.
Right.
It had a profound impact on inflation, as you'll see.
All right, so the table in this article shows a 0.6% inflation rate in 1929. Pretty mild. But then in the years that followed, things get dramatic.
Yeah.
We see deflation setting in with rates of negative 6.4%, negative 9.3%, and even 10.3% in 1932.
Wow.
That's a massive shift.
It really highlights how economic shocks like the stock market crash can send ripple effects throughout the entire system, including prices.
And this deflationary period persisted for much of the 1930s, a truly difficult time.
Yes.
But then as we move into the late 1930s and early 1940s, we see inflation start to climb again.
Right.
It's happening during this period.
The late 1930s marked the beginning of recovery from the Great Depression, but then another major event took center stage: World War II. The U.S. enters the war in 1941, and we see inflation jump to 9.9% that year.
Oh, wow.
It's a classic example of how wartime economies often experience inflationary pressure.
Why is that? What's the link between war and inflation?
Think about what happens during wartime. Governments ramp up spending on military equipment and personnel.
Okay.
There's a surge in demand for resources, and often we see rationing of goods.
Right.
All of these factors put upward pressure on prices.
So even though war is obviously devastating in countless ways,
Yes.
it seems to have this unintended consequence of fueling inflation.
It's a complex dynamic, and the economic consequences of war can be far-reaching.
Yeah.
Now let's fast forward a few decades to the 1970s, a period marked by a unique phenomenon: stagflation.
I've heard that term, but I have to admit I'm not entirely sure what it means.
Stagflation is a really interesting and frankly challenging economic situation. It's when you have high inflation combined with slow economic growth, sometimes even recession.
Oh.
It's like the worst of both worlds. Prices are soaring, but jobs are scarce and the economy is sluggish.
That sounds like a recipe for economic misery. What happened in the 1970s that led to this stagflation?
A few key factors were at play. One of the biggest was the oil crisis of 1973.
The oil crisis.
Oil prices quadrupled practically overnight, sending shockwaves through the global economy.
Wow.
This had a direct impact on inflation, as energy costs are a significant part of many goods and services.
So that oil shock really threw things out of whack.
Yeah.
But were there other factors that contributed to the stagflation of the 1970s?
Yes. Alongside the oil crisis, there were also some domestic policy issues that economists believe contributed to the problem.
Okay.
Some argue that government spending programs and certain regulatory policies of the time exacerbated both inflation and the economic slowdown.
It's fascinating how multiple factors can converge to create these unique economic situations.
Right.
So the 70s were a real challenge.
Yeah.
But then things start to shift as we head into the 1980s.
Yeah.
What changed?
The 1980s saw a new approach to economic policy, often associated with President Reagan.
Reagan.
Now, we won't get into the politics of it,
Right.
but these policies like tax cuts and deregulation were specifically aimed at stimulating the economy and curbing inflation.
So regardless of one's political views, it's clear that those policy changes had a noticeable impact on inflation.
Yeah.
The data shows a significant decline in inflation rates throughout the 1980s.
Uh-huh.
But the article also mentions a surge in military spending during this period.
Right.
Didn't that have an inflationary effect?
That's a great point. You're right. The 1980s also saw a significant increase in military spending, driven in part by the Cold War.
Right.
And increased government spending, even on defense, can indeed contribute to inflationary pressures.
It seems like policymakers are always trying to balance competing priorities.
Yeah.
Controlling inflation, stimulating the economy, and addressing national security concerns.
Exactly. And those priorities sometimes clash.
Right.
In the late 1980s, we saw another event that shook the financial system: the savings and loan crisis.
What happened during the S&L crisis? I vaguely remember hearing about it.
Essentially, many savings and loan institutions, which were similar to banks, had made a lot of risky loans, and a large number of them ended up failing.
So another financial meltdown, but this time centered on the S&Ls.
Yes, and while the crisis didn't directly cause a huge spike in inflation, it did force the government to step in and bail out many of these institutions.
Right.
This added to the national debt, which can have long-term implications for the economy, including inflation.
It's a reminder that these financial crises, even if they don't immediately impact inflation, can create ripple effects that are felt for years to come.
Exactly.
So we've seen some turbulent times in the 70s and 80s, but then we enter the 1990s.
Yeah.
What was happening with inflation during that decade?
The 1990s were actually a period of relative calm and steady economic growth.
Okay.
Inflation remained fairly low and stable throughout the decade.
That was also the time when globalization really took off, right?
Uh-huh.
The internet was booming, we saw new trade agreements, and the world seemed to be shrinking.
You're exactly right. And many economists believe that this surge in global trade actually helped keep inflation in check during the 1990s.
Interesting.
Think about it: when you can produce goods more cheaply in other countries and access a wider range of suppliers, that can create downward pressure on prices.
That makes sense. So globalization, while it has its complexities and certainly its critics, might have played a role in taming inflation during that period.
It's definitely a factor to consider. Now, as we move into the 2000s, we've already talked about the 2008 financial crisis and its deflationary impact.
Right.
But what about the years leading up to the crisis?
The early 2000s were the dot-com boom years, weren't they? Lots of excitement about technology, the new economy, but also some spectacular crashes.
That's right. While inflation remained relatively subdued during this period, there were growing concerns about asset bubbles, particularly in the tech sector. We saw some companies with sky-high valuations, often based on future potential rather than current profits.
And as history has shown time and again, those bubbles eventually burst.
Exactly. And when those bubbles burst, it can send shockwaves through the economy.
Yeah.
While inflation wasn't the primary concern during the dot-com boom, it was still influenced by these larger economic trends.
Then, of course, we have the 2010s.
Right.
This decade was marked by several significant events that impacted inflation.
You're thinking of the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the rise of quantitative easing, and the shale oil revolution.
Quantitative easing. Now, that's a term I've heard thrown around, but I'm not sure I fully grasped what it means.
It's a bit complex,
Yeah.
but in simple terms, it's a tool that the Federal Reserve or Fed uses to try to stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply.
Okay.
Essentially, the Fed buys large amounts of bonds from banks injecting money into the system.
Got it.
This can encourage lending and investment, but if not managed carefully, it can also lead to inflation.
So the Fed was using quantitative easing quite aggressively in the wake of the 2008 crisis to try to get the economy back on track.
That's right.
And what about that shale oil revolution you mentioned?
Well, that was a game changer in the energy sector.
Okay.
The U.S. became a major oil producer thanks to new fracking technologies, which led to a huge increase in oil production.
Wow.
This actually helped keep energy prices and overall inflation lower.
That's a great example of how technological innovation can sometimes have a deflationary effect.
Right.
Especially when it leads to increased supply of a key commodity like oil.
It highlights the complex interplay of factors that influence inflation.
Yeah.
It's not always a simple equation.
Now, before we move on to the present day, I'd like to pause here and reflect on what we've learned so far.
Absolutely. What stands out to you?
Well, it's amazing to see how inflation has been shaped by so many different forces like wars, economic booms and busts, technological advancements, even government spending. It's almost like this historical drama
Right.
playing out on the economic stage.
And as we've seen, it's not always a straightforward story.
Right.
Sometimes those forces push inflation up, sometimes they pull it down, and the Fed is constantly trying to manage those pressures.
Right. Speaking of the future, before we went to our last break, you left us with a really intriguing question. What are the big trends on the horizon that could influence inflation in the years to come?
There are a few key areas to watch. One that economists are paying close attention to is demographics, specifically the aging of the population.
Okay.
As baby boomers continue to retire, they tend to spend less, which could slow down economic growth and potentially put downward pressure on inflation.
So more retirees could mean less demand,
Yeah.
which might keep prices in check.
That's one possible outcome. However, an aging population also means a greater need for healthcare, a sector where costs often rise faster than in other areas.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Right.
Less spending overall, but potentially more spending in a sector that's prone to inflation.
What is that?
What about technology? Earlier, we talked about how the shale oil revolution helped lower energy prices.
Yeah.
Could we see similar technological disruptions that impact inflation in other ways?
Absolutely. Automation is one to watch closely.
Okay.
As robots and artificial intelligence become more sophisticated, they could potentially replace human workers in a wider range of industries.
Wow.
This could lead to lower production costs, which could translate into lower prices for consumers.
So the rise of the robots could actually have a deflationary effect.
It's a real possibility, but of course it's not quite that simple.
Right.
There are many social and economic implications to consider with automation,
Of course.
but from a purely inflationary perspective, it's certainly a trend to watch.
Okay, so we've got demographics and automation. Any other big forces on the horizon? And I think we can't talk about the future without mentioning the big one, climate change.
You're right. Climate change is likely to have a significant impact on inflation in a number of ways. For one, it could lead to more frequent and severe natural disasters, which can disrupt supply chains and push prices up.
We've already seen that happen with hurricanes and wildfires in recent years.
Exactly.
Those events can cause shortages and price spikes.
Exactly. And as the planet warms, we may also see changes in agricultural yields, which could impact food prices.
So climate change could hit us right in the grocery cart.
It's not out of the realm of possibility. And then there's the cost of transitioning to a cleaner economy.
Right.
Investing in renewable energy, adapting infrastructure, all of that could potentially lead to higher prices in the short term.
It sounds like climate change is a real wild card when it comes to inflation.
Yeah.
It's hard to predict exactly how it will play out, but it's clear that it will have an impact.
It's one of the most complex and unpredictable factors in the equation. And speaking of complex and unpredictable, we should also consider the future of globalization.
Okay.
We talked about how it may have helped keep inflation down in the 1990s, but the world is a very different place now.
Right. With rising geopolitical tensions, talk of deglobalization and supply chains being rerouted, it feels like we're in a period of transition.
Exactly. And those shifts could lead to higher production costs, which could mean higher prices for consumers.
So the era of cheap goods from around the world might be coming to an end.
It's certainly a possibility.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about. As we wrap up our deep dive into inflation, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listener to remember?
I think the most important takeaway is that inflation is not a simple phenomenon.
Right.
It's influenced by a whole web of interconnected factors, both domestic and global.
It's not just about greedy corporations or government printing too much money,
Right.
as some people might think. It's much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. It's also crucial to remember that a little inflation is actually normal and even beneficial for a healthy, growing economy. It's when inflation gets out of control that it becomes problematic.
And we've seen those periods of high inflation throughout history.
Yes.
They can be really disruptive and painful for everyone.
Absolutely.
Right.
And finally, I think it's empowering to remember that we as individuals are not powerless in the face of inflation. By understanding how it works, being aware of the trends that might impact it, and making informed financial decisions, we can help mitigate its impact on our own lives.
Knowledge is power, right?
Yes,
Especially when it comes to navigating the complexities of the economy.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, you've certainly equipped our listener with a wealth of knowledge today. We've covered nearly a century of inflation history, explored the forces that drive it, and even peered into the future to consider the trends that might shape inflation in the years to come.
And for those who are eager to delve even deeper, I highly recommend checking out the full Investopedia article that we've been discussing. It's called U.S. Inflation Rate by Year, 1929 to 2024, and it's a treasure trove of data and insights.
We'll make sure to include a link in the show notes. And just a quick teaser for future deep dives. We've been looking at inflation broadly, but we could do some fascinating deep dives into how inflation specifically impacts different sectors of the economy, like housing, food, energy, healthcare. Each sector has its own unique story to tell.
I'd love to explore those.
Well, for now, we've reached the end of our inflation odyssey. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've learned something new, or at least had your curiosity piqued. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and don't let inflation get the best of you.